March 23, 1956, at 2:14 p.m. in a gleaming Cadillac showroom on Union Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. The afternoon sun cut through the display windows, casting long shadows across the polished chrome of America's most prestigious automobiles. A young man just 21 years old stood near the entrance, his hands trembling slightly as he fingered the $4,827 cashier's check in his jacket pocket. His pomade-slicked hair caught the light as he turned his head, taking in the rows of magnificent machines that represented everything he'd dreamed about since he was a boy pressing his nose against car dealership windows. Elvis Aaron Presley had driven here in his mother's borrowed 1951 Plymouth, the one with the cracked windshield and the engine that knocked whenever you pushed it past 40 miles per hour. He'd parked it 3 blocks away, not wanting anyone to see what he'd arrived in. His palms were sweating despite the cool March air, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. This wasn't stage fright, he'd conquered that demon months ago. This was something else entirely. This was the fear of a young man about to claim his place in a world that had always told him he didn't belong. He'd been up since 4:47 that morning, unable to sleep, packing the small house on Audubon Drive that he'd just bought for his parents. Gladys had made him eggs and bacon, but he couldn't eat. His stomach was tied in knots thinking about this moment. He changed his shirt 3 times, finally settling on a conservative gray jacket and black slacks, the kind of outfit he thought a serious car buyer would wear. He wanted to look respectable. He wanted to look like he belonged here among the crystal chandeliers and the marble floors and the salesmen in their 3-piece suits, who moved through the showroom like they owned the world. The showroom manager, Harold Morrison, was a 53-year-old veteran of the luxury car business who'd been selling Cadillacs since before Elvis was born. Morrison stood behind his mahogany desk, watching this peculiar young man through the glass partition of his office. He'd seen the boy wandering among the cars for the past 12 minutes, never touching anything, just looking with the kind of hunger Morrison usually associated with window shoppers, dreamers who would waste his salesman's time talking about cars they'd never be able to afford. Morrison straightened his burgundy tie and emerged from his office with the practiced smile of a man who'd perfected the art of polite dismissal. His shoes clicked against the showroom floor with military precision as he approached Elvis, who was standing transfixed before a pink and white 1956 Cadillac Fleetwood Series 60. It was a special order that had just arrived that morning, $5, $462 worth of American luxury with a hydromatic transmission and power everything. "Can I help you, son?" Morrison's voice carried that particular tone of condescension wrapped in false courtesy that men in power reserve for those they consider beneath them. Elvis turned, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Yes, sir, I'd like to buy this car." Morrison's smile tightened imperceptibly. He gave Elvis a long, appraising look, taking in the young man's clothes, nice enough but clearly off the rack. The shoes were polished but worn at the heels. The watch was a Timex, not a Rolex. Everything about this boy screamed working class, from his nervous mannerisms to the way he kept his hands stuffed in his pockets like he was afraid to touch anything. "This particular model is quite expensive," Morrison said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "It's our top-of-the-line Fleetwood. Perhaps I could show you something more practical. We have some used models in the back lot that might be more suitable for someone of your circumstances." The words hung in the air like a slap. Elvis's face flushed red from his collar to his hairline. "I didn't ask about used cars, sir. I asked about this one." Morrison's patronizing smile never wavered. "Young man, I've been in this business for 28 years. I can tell just by looking at someone whether they're a serious buyer or just a dreamer. You're what, 20, 21? Let me give you some free advice. Stick to something you can actually afford. There's no shame in driving a Ford or a Chevrolet. Most young men your age would be thrilled with a nice used sedan. This car," he gestured dismissively at the Cadillac, "costs more than most people make in 3 years. You couldn't afford the insurance, much less the payment plan." "I'm not looking for a payment plan," Elvis said quietly, his jaw tightening. Morrison actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of derision. "Son, do you have any idea what this car costs? We're talking about $5,462, cash." $5,462, Elvis repeated, his voice steady now despite the burning in his chest. "And 38 cents including tax." Morrison's expression shifted from amused condescension to irritation. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have time for this. You're too young, too different to be driving a car like this. These cars are for successful businessmen, doctors, lawyers, people who have earned their place in society. You don't fit into the boxes of our typical clientele. You're not commercially viable as a Cadillac owner. The image doesn't work." Each word was like a knife twisting in Elvis's gut. He could feel the familiar sting behind his eyes, the one he'd felt so many times before in school when teachers told him he'd never amount to anything, at the Memphis recording service when the secretary had barely looked up at him, at the Grand Ole Opry when they'd told him to go back to driving trucks. His hands were shaking worse now, and he could taste copper in his mouth from biting the inside of his cheek. Sir, Elvis's voice cracked slightly and he hated himself for it. I have the money. Morrison's face hardened. Young man, even if you did, which I highly doubt, I wouldn't sell you this car. You want to know why? Because Cadillac has an image to maintain. We can't have just anyone driving our vehicles. It cheapens the brand, you understand? You're not our kind of customer. You never will be. So why don't you save us both some time and embarrassment and head on down to the Ford dealership on Summer Avenue? I'm sure they'd be happy to set you up with something more appropriate. The dismissal was final, brutal, and delivered with the casual cruelty of someone so certain of their authority that they didn't even consider the possibility they might be wrong. Elvis stood there for a moment, his whole body trembling now, not with fear but with something else. Humiliation mixed with rage mixed with a pain so deep it felt like drowning. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the showroom, Morrison's satisfied smirk burning into his back like a brand. He made it to the door, pushed through it, and stumbled into the parking lot where the March wind hit his burning face like a blessing and a curse. He barely made it to the side of the building before the tears came. Elvis Presley, who just 6 weeks ago had appeared on national television for the first time, who had thousands of fans screaming his name, who had finally started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was somebody. That same Elvis Presley slumped against the brick wall of the Cadillac dealership and cried like he hadn't cried since he was 13 years old. For nearly 2 hours he sat in that parking lot, his back against the cold brick, his dreams crumbling into dust around him. It wasn't about the car, it had never been about the car. The Cadillac was supposed to be proof that he'd made it, proof that all the nights playing honky-tonks for $10 in tips had meant something, proof that when Sam Phillips had told him he had something special, he wasn't lying. Proof that he wasn't just that white boy who sings colored like they whispered behind his back. But Morrison had seen right through him, hadn't he? Had seen the truck driver's son playing dress-up in a world where he didn't belong. The tears came harder as Elvis remembered every rejection, every closed door, every moment someone had looked at him and decided he wasn't enough. His body shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones, each one ripping something loose inside him. At 4:31 p.m., his tears finally spent, Elvis sat in the gathering dusk with his head in his hands. His mother would be wondering where he was. She'd have dinner ready, probably the pork chops he liked with cornbread and green beans. She'd take one look at his red eyes and know something was wrong, and she'd want to make it better because that's what Gladys Presley did. She made things better. The thought of his mother shifted something inside him. The sorrow that had consumed him for the past 2 hours began to transform, crystallizing into something harder, sharper. It wasn't quite anger. Anger was too simple, too fleeting. This was something else. This was conviction. This was determination. This was the same feeling he'd had the first time he'd walked into Sun Records after being turned away 3 times. Elvis stood up, his legs shaky but holding. He wiped his face with his sleeve, not caring that it would leave marks on the gray jacket. He pulled the cashier's check from his pocket and looked at it in the fading light. $4,827. Every penny he'd saved from his record sales, his appearances, his concerts. He'd planned to use the leftover money after buying the car to get his mother a new washing machine. But standing there in that parking lot, something fundamental had shifted in Elvis Aaron Presley. The boy who had walked into that showroom was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone who understood that the Harold Morrisons of the world would always exist, would always be there to tell him he wasn't good enough, wasn't the right kind, didn't fit into their neat little boxes. The barely controlled anger that coursed through his veins wasn't destructive, it was fuel, it was power. It was the same force that made him move on stage in ways that scandalized parents and thrilled teenagers. It was the thing that made him different, and for the first time in his life, Elvis understood that being different wasn't a limitation. It was his strength. He thought about his mother then, really thought about her. Gladys Love Presley, who'd grown up picking cotton, who'd never had more than a third-grade education, who'd loved him with a fierceness that sometimes scared him. She'd told him something once when he was 14 and had come home crying because the kids at school had laughed at him for entering a talent show. "Baby," she'd said, holding his face in her work-worn hands, "when people tell you you're too different, what they're really saying is that they're too limited to understand you. Their boxes are too small for your spirit. That's not your failing, honey, that's theirs." He hadn't understood it then, he understood it now. Elvis pulled out his pocket watch. 4:47. He had a decision to make. He could go home, deposit the check back in the bank, and accept that the Harold Morrisons of the world had the power to decide who deserved what, or he could do something else. Something that would require him to be exactly who Harold Morrison said he couldn't be. Strong people turn pain into power. Another thing his mama had said, usually when his daddy was passed out drunk and the electricity had been cut off again. Strong people turn pain into power. Elvis looked back at the Cadillac showroom, its lights now blazing against the gathering darkness. Through the windows, he could see Morrison talking to another salesman, probably laughing about the delusional kid who thought he could buy a Cadillac. His jaw tightened and he made his decision. He didn't go home. Instead, Elvis walked the 3 blocks back to his mother's Plymouth, started it up despite the protesting engine, and drove to the other Cadillac dealership. The one on the colored side of town, where they were used to dealing with musicians and entertainers who didn't fit into the conventional boxes of success. It was run by a man named Solomon Burke, who'd made his fortune selling luxury cars to the people that places like Morrison's wouldn't serve. But Elvis didn't go in right away. He sat in the Plymouth for another hour, not crying now but thinking, planning, understanding something fundamental about the world and his place in it. When he finally walked into Burke's dealership at 6:15 p.m., he wasn't the same shaky kid who'd entered Morrison's showroom. He moved differently now, with the same energy he brought to the stage, controlled, purposeful, electric. Solomon Burke himself greeted Elvis, having recognized him from his television appearance. "Mr. Presley," he said with genuine warmth, "how can I help you this evening?" "I'd like to buy a car," Elvis said, his voice steady. "A pink Cadillac, and I'd like it delivered to Union Avenue tomorrow morning, to Morrison's showroom." Burke raised an eyebrow but said nothing except, "We can certainly arrange that." The next morning, March 24, 1956, at exactly 9:00 a.m., Elvis Presley stood in front of Morrison's Cadillac showroom as Solomon Burke's delivery driver pulled up in a gleaming pink 1955 Cadillac Fleetwood Series 60, even more expensive than the one Morrison had refused to sell him. Elvis had paid $5,847 in cash, and he'd specifically requested that it be delivered here to this spot at this time. Harold Morrison was just arriving for work, his coffee in one hand, his morning paper in the other. He stopped dead when he saw Elvis standing next to the pink Cadillac, signing autographs for a growing crowd of teenagers who'd somehow heard he'd be there. Elvis didn't say a word to Morrison. He didn't need to. He simply got into his pink Cadillac, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Morrison standing there with his mouth open and his coffee growing cold in his hand. But before he left, Elvis did one thing. He stepped down from his new throne on wheels, walked over to Morrison, and handed him something. It was a signed photograph, the kind his new manager, Colonel Parker, had just had printed up. On it, Elvis had written, "To Harold, don't be cruel, Elvis Presley." It was a masterclass in human dignity. Not revenge, but recalibration. Elvis had taken Morrison's rejection and transformed it into something else entirely, proof that the limitations others tried to place on him were really just revelations of their own narrowness. Within 6 months, Harold Morrison would be forced to publicly apologize for the incident when it became national news. "I was dead wrong," he would tell reporters. "I was too limited to understand what I was seeing." Elvis Presley wasn't too different to be commercially viable. He was so different that he would redefine what commercially viable meant. But that public apology wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what happened in the soul of a 21-year-old kid who learned that rejection isn't failure. It's just someone else's inability to see what you see in yourself. What mattered was that Elvis Presley understood that being told you don't fit into the boxes isn't a condemnation. It's a calling to build new boxes, or better yet, to live without boxes at all. The pink Cadillac would become one of the most famous cars in American history, a symbol not just of success but of transformation, of turning pain into power, of refusing to let someone else's limitations become your own. Elvis would go on to buy dozens of Cadillacs, giving them away to friends, family, and strangers who needed to believe that dreams could come true. But he never forgot that first one, the one he'd been told he couldn't have, couldn't afford, didn't deserve. Years later, when asked about that day, Elvis would say, "That man did me a favor. He taught me that legends don't start as legends. They start as hopeful young people with a dream and the courage to pursue it despite being told they're not good enough. He taught me that every no is just redirecting you to a better yes. He taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is succeed in front of the people who said you'd fail." The untold legacy of Elvis Presley isn't just about the music or the fame or the cultural revolution he sparked. It's about a young man who was told he couldn't afford something, not just a car, but a dream, a life, a place in the world, and who responded by redefining what those things meant. It's about understanding that when someone tells you that you're too different, too young, too anything, they're really telling you about their own limitations, not yours. That pink Cadillac sits in Graceland now, preserved behind glass, a monument to a moment when a rejected young man chose to turn his pain into power. Visitors often ask why of all his cars that one is displayed so prominently. The answer is simple. It represents the moment Elvis Presley stopped asking for permission to be himself and started giving others permission to be themselves. The real untold legacy is this: every single one of us will face our Harold Morrison. Every one of us will stand in our version of that showroom and be told we don't belong, can't afford it, aren't the right kind of person. The question isn't whether we'll face that rejection, we will. The question is what we'll do with it. Will we accept it as truth or will we recognize it for what it really is, someone else's limitation, not our own? Have you ever been told you weren't good enough? What did you do to prove them wrong?